Da da da! What's my good cheer? Welcome, everybody. Let's give YouTube a couple of minutes, get those notifications out. In the meantime, if you've never met me before, hi, I'm Cindy. I explore the inside and the outside, and I'm going to start off with an apology because I don't know what's going on. I don't know if it's a YouTube or a camera issue or a Cindy issue. But I'm not happy because I don't have a thumbnail tonight except for my brand channel. I hope that's good. Hopefully, after our live tonight, I can go back in and fix it a little bit. If not, it is in that adapt and conquer and finding ways to course correct in what we get wrong, right? Okay, you guys, my desk is covered in fluids. So thirsty today, you guys. I'm really, really thirsty. And I've been guzzling a little bit, but you know what? It's important to get our fluids in. As you guys pop in, say hi. Uh, Today was a listing day for me. I just kind of hung out with myself, went to the grocery store, picked up a few groceries, and just came in and just had an enjoyable afternoon. But in the last minute, I'm going, oh my goodness, Cindy, you need to relax and lay in the bathtub. That's exactly what I did. Then I got up and I got, oh my goodness, right on time for my live, right? Then noticed I didn't even have a cup of coffee, made a cup of coffee, made a jug of juice, and then came in, and then in setting up my live, right, it just didn't work for me, and I thought I had done something wrong, so I deleted what I had done and got back in, tried to refix it. It came out the exact same way, and you can see in that little bit of fluster, and it's good for people to see how I fluster because it's really neat because I go right into fix it mode and I go 100 miles an hour, right? And in the end, I give it a shot to see if I can work things out. And if I can't, then I work with what I've got. But then I always feel better because it's always or I don't feel as good because it's always my intent to come in here and be on time and everything set up perfectly and right. And then just be able to let myself go and go into that flow. But I have to say, I am only human. And it's something that I really have to accept about myself, not to be so hard on myself, not to think, just because I've made a mistake that there's something wrong with me, that this isn't the place where I'm supposed to be, right? And sometimes it's in that intent that we feel bad, right? That we kind of throw our arms up and say, I give up. You guys were right. I'll never get this straight. But if you're anything like me, you're not a giver upper, right? You'll show up to the game even if you know that you don't like sports, but because somebody is going by themselves and they need some company, right? You volunteered. But it's in that honesty, right? Because if you go to that game and you're sitting next to somebody and you're looking bored and distracted and looking around and jumping up to go to the washroom, or like I did when I was a little kid. My dad used to take me to all the games. We're from Vancouver. We go to the Whitecaps soccer, we go to the BC Lions, we go to the Vancouver Canucks and the hockey. My dad loved sports, but he only had girls, right? And I was always happy and joyful and grateful that my dad wanted to spend time with me. This is how I looked at it, that he wanted to spend time with me, but not recognizing because I'm just a kid, right? Spending time with her dad, not putting myself in my dad's shoes and saying, well, he had to go to the hockey game. He got free tickets to the football game. He wants to go, but he doesn't want to go by himself. He can't find anybody else who wants to go with him. So you know what? He'll take one of his kids with him. But I don't look at it that way. I look at what's being offered into my life. And, I would jump at a chance just to spend 5 minutes with my dad. And that is the truth, and what I was using that as an analogy for. But if I was there and I was bored and I kept jumping up and going to the concession stand, which I did, right? Go to the bathroom, stare around, where I'm going, look at the people, do anything except pay attention to the game because I just was not interested in sports. That didn't make my father feel bad because he didn't have any expectations that I would enjoy the game, that I would pay attention, that I would want to learn it, right? But he was grateful, and I was grateful too that we got to find those few minutes together to enjoy each other's company. My dad was a shiner too. Epigenetically, right? It just moves straight down the line. And it's only in the past little while that I've come to appreciate that my story, my difficulties, even though those struggles and the way I felt about myself was specially made up for me. It was a special recipe for me, right? Number one, he's male, I'm female, and less tolerance. And sometimes, too, that we get used to it after, you've been, right, put down for so long or made to just feel terrible about yourself or make you feel like you're the bad person in the story. After a while, you get to really feel that it's all your fault, that you're the bad guy because it's projected onto. That's the programming. That's with intent that happens. And because I understand now about epigenetics, right? I recognize that the same thing happened to my grandfather, right? That my grandfather had a big heart, but oh my goodness, he was nasty and scary when he was drinking. And my grandfather was an alcoholic, but he didn't pass alcoholism down to my father, though my father did drink. I didn't find that out until after he passed away in my oh my goodness, I was already married by then. So I was in my mid 30s before I found out that my dad was a bit of a drinker. He was never an alcoholic like my grandfather was. My grandfather was a chronic. He was one of those people that lived on the streets or in the bus shacks and stuff. He was that bad. But my grandfather always tried to beat his addictions. I remember, even as a child and as a teenager, that my grandfather would go great periods of time without drinking. And when he did that, he was a hard worker. He was a kind man. And he didn't use people and abuse people like he did when he was drinking, right? Because he was a totally different person when he was involved in his addictions. My father's drug of choice was gambling, and that was his big addiction. But I'm sure there were others. For me, my big addiction was food, still is something that I struggle with, is the food. But I also found relief in my system by being a gambler. It's really surprising that I'm even saying that because being a gambler pretty much destroyed my marriage, right? destroyed my relationships with my sisters because, after a while you get to use those resources, and right, those resources quite often are our families, right? And that's where we get that feeling that we're the bad guy, that it's all our fault. But it's those addictions. Those are those things that we pass down from one generation to a next. And even though they might be a different drug of choice, they're meant to do the same thing. They're meant to calm the system, to make it so that there's something in our life that we have control over. And isn't that sad to say that all we have left in life is the control of our addictions? In the end, it was to each one of our choices. My dad never beat his gambling addiction. I am so grateful. And gambling and food were not my only addictions. I had to overcome a lot of them, right? And grateful, some of them were really easy for me to quit, like quitting smoking. The first time I technically tried to quit smoking, I did it. I went on the patch and I never had a cigarette after that. Never, right? But we have to look at our addictions and say, okay, well, we are going to give up this addiction, but what are we going to replace it with? Right? And it has to be something. You just can't quit eating. You just can't go on like January 1st on New Year's Day saying, "Okay, I'm going on a diet and I'm losing 40 pounds." And you go on a diet. And it lasts a week and you beat yourself up. You feel terrible because you went off your diet, right? And you think you're good for nothing because this is the programming that got us to that state where we needed these addictions just to alleviate some of that emotional and mental pain, right? I'm not going to say physical because if you lose your legs and you start drinking, you're drinking still to alleviate that emotional and mental pain, right? You're not drinking because it makes your legs feel better. You don't have any legs. And I don't mean to be disrespectful in that, but just to drive that nail home about how our emotions and how our mentality can really trick us into thinking that we are making things better, making things feel like it's bearable. And when I was gambling, like I said, I spent all my money. Like I had a good job. I was making more money than my husband was, and he was in the military. Like he was making good money himself, especially when he was going on the tours, and I was still making more money than him. And then coming home and he'd say, "Oh, Cindy, I need lunch money, or I'm going out with the guys after work." And I wouldn't have anything. What? Was it a slow night? I work bars and nightclubs, right? So I make good money. We'll just put it at that, right? Some days were better than others. But, I would say, oh, I had to put gas in the car or I had to pay a bill. And I wasn't even paying the bills. I was just juggling them just enough so that, the bill collectors wouldn't call, right? And I became a sneaky person. And then after a while, I just could not control because of I had lost a lot of weight and I noticed that I was gaining weight back. And of course, that was compounding me. I'd never been a wife before, right? Like I married my first real boyfriend, and it was scary for me, right? Because I've always been a spectator in other people's relationships and never really delved into my own. And being that codependent that I was, with my father. We were a little bit codependent on each other. We were both shiners. We shined on each other, and we helped each other get through those difficult times, for the longest time. Now, I don't mean to run off from that story about my husband and addictions, which is really important, but people have to understand that we do need things to cope with difficulties sometimes. That's why we have hobbies and interests and do things that we love. It's to help us, right? To not delve into those addictions that are not healthy for us mentally, emotionally, or physically, right? Because if you're a drunk person, well, you're not paying attention to the traffic. You can get smacked and be done. Your life is over. Not even a chance to be able to overcome some of these limitations that we have and these addictions that we have and these beliefs that we have, and then we die at the same state as possibly we moved into, right? When we first started to need these things to cope with. And I believe that any moment where we're able to be clarity, there was a word this week, right? To be clear in our minds and in our souls and in our beings, that lots of times we can make movement, even if we're unaware, even if we never wake up to some of these ideas. Sometimes, right, in not having those addictions, we want to do better. We're feeling better. So we try harder. Like my grandpa when he quit drinking for a year, right? And he would just be the nicest person ever. It makes me curious to wonder what his dad was like and his grandfather was like, because it's like cannibalism almost. That's what it is. It's like sacrificing the next generation, right? Just sacrificing themselves, sacrificing the generation because we beat and we're not looking to hold on to those emotions that make us feel bad. We want to give them away. We want somebody else to hold them. If we could toss them away and never see or experience them again, we would. But we usually, what we do is we lay them on somebody else. And what easier way to do it than to lay it on your own family members? So it takes a lot for us to have that empathy and compassion for somebody who, right, is well, they're not treating you well if they're turning a blind eye, right? And sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where somebody else has something over your head, right? And the deal is, right, you have to put up with my temper. You have to put up with my anger. You have to put up with how I bring up my family, my children, right? And we look at that and we feel even more compelled to delve into those things that help us cope with what we're sacrificing, right? We're sacrificing ourselves, right? I would hate to think, because I didn't wake up to any of these ideas until I was well into my 40s, late 40s, early 50s. I'm going to say late 40s because a lot of it happens even before you just get that jolt of, oh my goodness, okay, now we're on this roller coaster. Sometimes, right, it is in those baby steps, right? And in those small bitefuls. And this is the way I don't like to be smacked upside the head with insights and knowings and understandings because it can be heartbreaking. But at the same time, there are these gifts to understand that nobody gets it right, right? Nobody gets it right. And you have to feel somebody's intent, you know? I knew my father loved me, right? And I understand now that he was an enabler, right? And you could say to me, "Oh my goodness, how can you say that about your own father?" It is in that acceptance of what is, right? What is true. My mother, right, ruled the coop. She held things over my dad's head. My mother had to pay, like my husband had to pay for my addictions in gambling. He had to pick up the slack in that. My mother had to pick up the slack in my dad's gambling. And there was a price to pay in that. And so he didn't get to have much say in how that house was run, right? And the best that he could do was the best that he could do. And those insights don't come because on the norm, because we hold these grudges against our parents, don't we? You know, if you guys never met me before, I come from a very dynamic family, a family of narcissists and empaths and borderlines. And that's the way that household was put together. But at the same time, those ingredients, all of those ingredients were the evidence for me because, we're rubbing up close to each other in that household and we pick up. That's why we do shadow work because, not every member in the family is going to be, right, moving forward in any way, right? And if they were moving forward, it might not be for lifetimes. It might just be in that lifetime or a few lifetimes, right? It's about putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And before we blame them, before we make them the bad guy, before we add more onto that plate of how bad they feel already for what they're doing or what they've done, that we understand that we are the children, right? I am my father's daughter, right? And my father was my grandfather's son. Epigenetically, this is passed down from generation to generation. And when I say, right, it's about our evolution, that, this isn't going to go on forever. I had the most amazing sisters, amazing nieces and nephews who are making movement for themselves that are totally outside of, right, what my father's life was like, what my grandfather's life was like. There is no alcoholism in my family anymore. That is done with my sisters, my nieces, their children for generations because it's not in our systems anymore, right? For the grace, I have no idea. I worked bars and nightclubs for most of my life and detested alcohol, right? Grateful for that. There were spans when we were young adults and we were clubbing and stuff like that, where we would have nights when we would go out and have at her, right? But it wasn't something that, we went home and we sat on the couch and, right? There was none of that. That it was a social kind of event for us, right? And, that is absolutely amazing. And my father gave us that. Remember what I said when I first started talking about this? My father was a drinker, but he didn't want his kids to know that he drank because of what was going on with his own father, right? And my mother never said anything to me. I never knew that my dad drank. And it wasn't till after I was married myself and my husband decided to send me to my mom's to stay at my mom's while he was on tour, right? It wasn't that he didn't trust me to be on my own. It was just because the government paid him to store all our furniture, and he was he was pretty good at finding the ins and outs of making money, and that was one of them. They paid him thousands of dollars to store our household, right? But that's not part of the story. But the part of the story is I had an opportunity. I took that time that I could only bear it for 6 months, right? He went on tour again. It wasn't going to happen again, but I went and stayed with my mom for those 6 months. But I took that opportunity to really try and get some of those questions answered about what went wrong, right? Between us, like why and not the other kids. And we went deep into these conversations, or I went deep. For the most part, she just kind of, right? And gave short yes and no answers and stuff. But in her yes and no's, and at that time, being an adult, I could read my mother like a book. I knew when she was lying, I knew when she was avoiding topics, and her personality didn't really change. She was older, so she wasn't physically violent anymore, but she could still bite, that woman. For sure she could still bite, right? Okay, so to get back to that, I didn't know that my father drank. He kept it from the kids. None of us kids knew that my dad was a little bit of a drinker like his father was, right? Probably not as bad because that's not something you could really hide. If you're like alcoholic, you are going to slip up. You can't keep a secret like that forever, right? But I never saw my dad, right, drinking, right, other than maybe a social beer. But we never had beer in the house or alcohol. He had a big bottle of tequila that sat on top of the TV for years and years and years. He picked it up in Vegas or something, and it was a Texas Mickey. That's what it was. And he had it sitting on top of the TV with a big worm sitting on the bottom. Right? Won't tell you what me and my sisters did with that bottle, because we did have parties in the house, because my parents would always go to Reno and Vegas all the time because it was only a day's drive to get down there, right? So yeah, I think I was 16 or 17 and had a big party, and that bottle disappeared real fast, and we ended up using water and food coloring. And my dad never, right, nothing got past my dad. He was so smart. He knew exactly when we were lying. He knew when we were up to no good, and we weren't angels, but we weren't bad kids either. None of us, right? We were just normal kids, but all different. All of us different. And my sister Tracy was my mom's favorite. I actually had a conversation with my second youngest sister, and I asked her about being the middle child, how it affected her. She said it didn't affect her at all. She was just happy to be out of all of that, right? And then I have a younger sister, but she was the baby. She was the favorite of all of us. So nothing really affected her very much, that maybe she got a little bit spoiled in her younger and older years. But the whole idea is to let people know that sometimes, we want the best for our own children. And that, if you're sitting on the couch and drinking your beers and your wine and your alcohol, or you're gambling and or you're overeating all the junk food, or you're smoking marijuana, you're sitting on the couch in front of your kids and you're doing this, that, like, even in the swearing, it's who we surround ourselves with, and we didn't see any of that, right? Every once in a while my dad would let a swear word fly, but swearing wasn't allowed in our household. We never saw alcohol in our household. We all knew my dad gambled. But as kids, we look at that as, oh, that's his fun, that's his hobby. You don't have the mentality really to understand that gambling is not good for you. I didn't understand that until I got hooked on those video lottery terminals when they started coming out in the early 90s, and I got hooked on them. With my first win, I went, oh my goodness, the answer for everything. And it turned out to be the problem for everything. And I was chasing that answer for everything, right? Until I quit. I have not touched a video lottery terminal in 6 years now. I will never touch one again. I don't even buy lottery tickets anymore. I won't even say, I bet you, right? Gambling is out of the picture for me. And I'm trying to be that example for my sisters, right? I have two sisters who gamble pretty hard. And one of them is pretty well to do, or was pretty well to do. I can't imagine, as much as she gambles now, that she's as well off as she was. But in those, how we cope, right? And that's what calms her system. And in those relationships, right, they go, she has a friend who is now my youngest sister. They live in the same building. And being the codependent I was, she was my best friend for most of my life. Besides my dad, she was my best friend for the most of my life. But, you know, that toxic. She was my mother's daughter, and my sister could bite too. And in the lessons, right, I knew I had to pull away. I wish I had been a little bit softer. I wish I had learned the lessons in baby steps, that it didn't hurt so bad, not hurt so bad for her, and not hurt so bad for me. Because again, those feelings of being the bad guy, those feelings of guilt and shame, which have always been my steering wheel at night, right? Or all my life, right? The guilt and shame, that it wouldn't have been so difficult. And it's taken some time in these past 6 years, and putting myself in her shoes and recognizing that, even though she was my mother's daughter, she was still my father's daughter too. And I could see the good in my sister, right? My sister was a dark in her lightness, right? And I, for myself, may be light in my darkness, in that codependency, always stumbling over myself, always trying to make people happy, take care of people, make sure everything was going well, nothing was going wrong. We all have our issues, and that's what they are, issues. But when we put our issues in somebody else's arms or somebody else's lap, that's not right, right? Right? We can't expect other people to hold our pain. And, one of the first things, and I'm not sure if I ever told anybody this before, but the first thing, and I don't hear voices or anything like that, but every once in a while, something comes through in my system that is so clear that it feels like a voice. It feels like a sentence or a word. But the first thing when I woke up to these ideas and it came rushing at me, I'm sure there were like 1,000 things all in 5 seconds. But you can't catch everything, but you kind of catch what you kind of pay attention to. And the first thing I heard was, we give energy, we don't take energy. We give energy. And that's why it's so important to find people like us, right? That's why I shined on my dad. And even though my dad was an enabler, he couldn't stop or have a say in anything that my mother, right, was doing. And he sat me down even. I believe it was in my senior year, and we sat on the front porch. And, his way was to have these conversations with me. And, he said to me, Cindy, he says, I would step in, right? I would step in, but it would be so much worse for you. And when he said that, I understood it. I got it, because my mother ran on jealousy and resentment. And it was that shining on me that my dad did. It was all that love that my dad gave to all his children, the hugs, the kisses, the I love yous. Kiss me before you go to school. Give me what are you doing going to bed before you give me a kiss, right? Like, this is the love that my mother didn't get as a child, right? And possibly she might have been something else if she had had that empathy, if she understood. But in that anger and in that bitterness, and, my mother didn't have a lot of addictions except for her limerence with my dad, right? My dad keeping her safe, right? There was a strange relationship going on there in that codependency and that narcissistic borderline that my right. And it's not to go into those conversations that I was privy to, because that is private. Even though my father's path, they are private between us, right? And I have my sisters in those considerations too. So I do the best that I can in that. But so much of my progress has come from, understanding, in the past 6 years, that one sentence when I first woke up: I give energy, I don't take energy. Well, what about those characters, which I believe my father was one of them, that survived on others' energy because he felt so terrible about himself? There was so much guilt and shame, and I'm worthless, and it's all my fault. I'm good for nothing, right? How is he supposed to drum up that energy for himself? Because I loved him. I shined on him. He didn't take my energy, I gave him my energy, right? I didn't take my dad's energy. My dad gave me his energy. And yes, right? He failed in himself, and he failed within his children and in his household and in his own life. He did that. But he succeeded in so many things. And that's one thing people have to remember. You look at your life, and what I was going to go back about those addictions that we let our children see and experience in us, right? Like my father hiding his drinking from his kids. None of us kids drink. We're not drinkers, right? That was a gift for my dad, who never ever wanted alcoholism to move past where he was at ever. And it worked, right? So, what I'm going to say, if you can't help yourself in the moment, because you can make that choice just like I did, right? In that gambling and in every other addiction. And I'm a very addictive person. I tell you, I've gone through so many different things that I have held on to in the hopes that it would kind of settle my system. But in the end, all of those things agitated my system. And when it agitated my system, I became a negative, right? And when I became a negative, I'm not producing any energy, right? I can only take energy. And, in that gambling and in taking my responsibility in that relationship that I had to pull away from with one of my sisters, that's got to be on me too. Because in my negativity, I pulled from her energy. Remember what I said? She was pretty well to do, and I became a strain on her, right? And we're not supposed to be feeding on each other, right? Loving energy is 10 times more amazing, right? Not limerence. Limerence is a different story. Lots of people mistake limerence for love, but limerence is only a need, right? It's only a transactional, right? I'll cook you dinner, right? You bring me the paycheck, right? You're a gambler. I'm going to tolerate the gambler. I'm going to work and I'll pay off the gambling debts when you mess up like that, you stupid people, right? But you know what? You got no say in how I bring up those kids, right? And that is feeding off others' energy. And lots of times, because it works, it's done with intent for no reason at all. You could be the nicest person ever and still feel like you're a piece of poop, that you're worthless, you're good for nothing, you have nothing to contribute to the world. And what happens when you truly feel that way and you decide just to leave the world? There's no opportunity for movement, right? If you're going to do something like that, if you're going to sacrifice yourself and your future like that, why don't you sacrifice that for those other parts of you, right? That need to have these lessons desperately, right? Desperately, because they don't understand. They're just getting dragged along from lifetime to lifetime, right? Cindy's never coming back. But I believe those other parts of me are coming back, right? When they talk about ancestors, that's my dad, that's my grandfather, right? And believe me, just as much as I'm my father, I'm my mother's daughter too. And I can't allow myself to forget that. That's what the shadow work is. And I just don't do shadow work from what I picked up from my mother. I do shadow work from what I picked up in my father's limitations. And that's what healing generations means, right? Just not to pass that crap down to the next generation like my dad did. That was a gift. That was a gift for his bloodline moving forward, or in the healing of a bloodline that he got dropped into, depending, right? Your ideas about religion, spirituality, reincarnation. To each one of us, we get to make those choices, right? Just as much as we get to make the choices. If we can't help ourselves, can we help our children? Can we help our grandchildren? Right? Because maybe it's too late for your children. Maybe they've picked up on those bad habits that you had or your grandparents or your parents had. Maybe they're already in it. But is there something you can do for the grandkids? Can you have a conversation with them like I had a conversation with my mother, right? Can you put your best foot forward in putting yourself in somebody else's shoes for the sake of generations moving forward? Like literally moving forward, right? Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I could go on about this stuff forever, you guys, because it's so detrimental in my own life. I believe it's what got me stuck. And even though I created the best life for myself as I possibly could, it wasn't the best life that was meant to be. And that's the truth. And that's on me. And there's nothing I can do about where I'm at right now. The past is the past, but also the answers and the forgiveness and the empathy, right? And that answers that you always wondered, right? Why? Right? Sometimes you don't get those answers from the source. Sometimes you have to dig for them. And when you hang out with me, we dig a little bit, right? But we try and do it a way that is kind and understanding, because I believe this is a process of evolution. I think we're in it right now, right? The whole world is waking up to some of these ideas, but it's a necessity. And in that light in the darkness and the darkness in the light, that is moving forward. That we're going to better get along with those dark parts of us. And those dark parts of us are going to have a chance now, right? To move into where they're supposed to be, to what they are, right? But because they've generation to generation to generation been passed the same story, the same circumstances, the same life, it just gets carried on until somebody says, that's enough, right? No more. And I think, to my dad's best abilities, right? That he did the very best that he could. And it was enough, right? It was enough, I think, for now. Was it the best? No. But in evolution, it is in failing and learning and picking ourselves up and dusting off our knees and just moving forward and just not giving up and just getting better and better and better, right? Does it mean we're not going to mess up again? Sure, we are, right? 2 feet. What is it? That saying? Two feet forward, 3 feet back. 3 foot forward, 1 foot back. Right? 3 feet forward, no feet back. Right? And then maybe something opens up till the next stage of evolution, where the light and the darkness becomes a little bit cloudy rather than one or the other. And the same with the dark and their lightness, right? A little bit cloudy, but a little bit better. Moving towards, right? Being what we're supposed to be in the creation of the best human being ever. Okay, you guys, really, I'm leaving at that right now. Let's go into a card, or do I leave it right there because I could find a title in that? I think I could. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. No card tonight. I made a snap, you guys. No card tonight. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm going to have my apple. I'm going to have my fluids. And I'm going to thank you very much. Have a great night. See you tomorrow.